Hey everyone, my name's Lee Byron, and I work at Facebook on our product infrastructure team and on a project called GraphQL. And GraphQL is what I want to talk a little bit about today. I'm going to walk through what GraphQL is, why we use it at Facebook, and talk a little bit about what we've already open sourced. And we'll start to investigate some of those pieces. And I'll publish a couple extra videos in the coming weeks to do deeper dives into individual topics on GraphQL. And so think about this video as a little bit of an overview. If you didn't see a video that I posted a couple weeks ago called Data Loader, you should check that out. Data Loader is a batching and caching mechanism that we use a version of at Facebook that really ties very nicely to GraphQL. I'm going to refer to it a couple of times, so if you haven't checked that video out, definitely go look at that. Also, if you haven't seen my talk from the React Europe conference last summer called Introducing GraphQL, you should take a look at that as well. That introduces the motivations for GraphQL and its history at Facebook, and could be really interesting to understand why we arrived at GraphQL and why we use it. So GraphQL powers our iOS and our Android apps and some parts of our website at Facebook, and it has really replaced our use of REST APIs. When people first hear about GraphQL, they think that we've written a new kind of graph database or something like that, and they think, you know, GraphQL it's cool that Facebook can use it, but it's not for us. It's not for our small project. I would encourage you to keep a little bit of an open mind as you hear more about this stuff. GraphQL is really not about querying databases. It's actually much more like a RPC language or a remote procedure call language. It is a language. It is a language that's about making queries about data, but at the end of the query, what you're actually doing is running arbitrary code, arbitrary functions, code that you provide to operate over your probably existing code base. And that's exactly how we use it at Facebook as well. What GraphQL is really three parts. It's a type system that you define. It's the query language that you use to ask questions about GraphQL. And then it's an execution and validation engine in between those two things that tie them together. What you're looking at now is GraphQL.org, which is our website that we use for documenting GraphQL and explaining what it's about. There's these 3 points that are really important. Being declarative, having a compositional nature, and having strong types. GraphQL is declarative in that you write queries as their own language, and you declare upfront every piece of information that you need. And this is really the major insight that GraphQL has atop other kinds of RPC systems or query systems like REST, is that you describe exactly what information you need, no more and no less. And a GraphQL server will give you the data in exactly the shape that you ask it for. And this ends up being really powerful in a couple different ways. It's compositional because often there's a similar piece of information that you need in many different parts of your application. And we provide a mechanism called GraphQL fragments that lets you define one small piece of a query and reuse it as many times as possible. It also composes nicely in parallel to a view hierarchy. So we often think about GraphQL in tandem to a view hierarchy like UI views in iOS or React on the web, where individual portions of your application define small pieces of a query. Those queries may refer to composed pieces of UI that are lower on the page or lower in your UI, and maybe composed upwards by things that use your piece of UI. And in doing so, we can ensure some pretty tight cohesion between a component and the data that it needs and the query where we actually ask for that data. Strong typed because everything in GraphQL has a type. And the types describe what kinds of fields are available on that piece of information. And we use this in a lot of different ways. We use it to generate documentation. We use it to validate that the queries that you send are actually legal. And then we use it in execution time to ensure that we understand exactly what kinds of functions we need to be calling on your server and in what order. So I think where we should go next from here is the specification. What we actually open sourced last summer was two things. we open sourced a specification for GraphQL that describes exactly what GraphQL is and how it works. And we published a reference implementation for GraphQL called GraphQL JS. We did it in JavaScript because a lot of our client-side tools are built in JavaScript. And so we can reuse a lot of these pieces to build language services and all kinds of interesting things as JavaScript client tools. But also, if your server runs in Node, and we often use Node to prototype things at Facebook, then you can use GraphQL JS in a Node server. So let's look at the spec. From the website here, we can click spec. And this is the GraphQL spec. It's just a working draft because it's still kind of changing over time. And the contents in here are the language, where we describe pretty much all of the rules for how the language works and why. And it's an LR1 parsable language. The type system, which describes all the different types in GraphQL, both the scalars that come built in, as well as the objects that and interfaces that you get to define. Introspection, which is a way of asking questions about the type system and getting those answers back as a facility to build interesting tools. Validation, which is a way of taking a look at a query and knowing before you even run it if that query is legal or not. So if there's any mistake in that query, a typo, something that would give you an ambiguous result, something of that nature. And execution. So given a query, how to actually run that query so that it returns exactly the data that you want. And then finally, what shape that response should be. So that's really it. Those are all the chapters of the spec. Obviously, there's a lot of detail in the spec, and if we go through some of these, once we get past our overview, you'll see that this goes into a lot of depth about how each of these things works. So there's for each piece of the language, a description about what that piece of language means, as well as exactly how you should parse it. And then once you get down to validation, all the different rules for validation. Once you get through the type system, all the different rules for the type system. And this document, it's, if you're new to GraphQL, don't read the specification. In the same way that if you're new to JavaScript, you wouldn't go read the JavaScript specification to understand JavaScript either. Just try it out and start using it. But certainly if you want to build a version of GraphQL for a new programming language, that's exactly the reason why we released this spec. And so while we released a reference implementation that's built in JavaScript, GraphQL has now been ported to over 10 different programming languages, including Scala, Java, Python, Ruby, PHP, and others. Feel free to peruse the spec if you're into that kind of thing. So here's the reference implementation that I've been talking about, GraphQL JS. And what GraphQL JS gives you is actual code that you can use that implements the ideas that are described in the spec. If you're familiar with installing JavaScript dependencies before, you just use npm install to set this up. And the first thing that you do is you build this type system. So we've been talking about this already, that you have a type system that you define that just calls arbitrary functions. And this is kind of the simplest possible hello world of a GraphQL schema. You define the schema, and a schema has a query type. And if you also have rights, you can define a mutation type as well. And a query type has some kind of name, whatever you want to give it. We've called this root query type, but whatever you want. And then a list of fields that you can call. And each field has a type. So in this case, we know that the field hello is definitely going to give us back a string. And it has a function that can be called. And every time that we query this field, we're going to call this function. It also defines the parser for the language and the execution environment as well. So you don't have to do any of that stuff. If you're using GraphQL JS, all you're really doing is defining the schema and setting that up. There's also a really nice Express plugin for GraphQL. So if you are using Express already, then it's really easy to start up a server that serves a GraphQL endpoint. One of the cool things about that is this tool that we call Graphical. Graphical is our kind of in-browser IDE that lets us try out some queries, run them, and get a result. And if you use Express GraphQL as a plugin for the Express server, then you kind of get this for free as soon as you load up your GraphQL endpoint. So what I have up here is GraphQL Swappy, which is a wrapper around the Swappy API. And I can open that up here, swappy.co. Swappy.co, it's just a really well executed REST API, super well documented, works really well. It has built-in schema using JSON schema. It's just a really well built REST API. It's also really nice for demos because you don't need any authentication tokens or anything like that to use it. So what we built here is a GraphQL schema that purely wraps that REST endpoint. So when I say that you can call any kind of function and do whatever you want, usually I mean that you're going to run a SQL query or a MongoDB query or something like that. But truly, you can do whatever you want. And in the case of what we're using right here, we're actually calling through to a REST API. So it's pretty interesting that you can do a lot of these things. So let's look at what a simple GraphQL query looks like. A GraphQL query always starts with open and close braces. And as I start typing this tool, we should get type ahead. Films, that's what I want. Okay, so I want to get all of my films. And I just want the episode ID and the title. The title would be nice. And if I run this query, then on the other side of the screen, I get the result. And the first thing that you'll probably notice is that the shape of this data matches very closely to what the query looks like. And perhaps an even better version of this is if I, instead of doing all films, I did a film of a particular film ID. So let's say 4. And I'll just reuse this stuff. Film ID and episode ID don't match up, which is, of course, that makes sense. Okay, so here you can really see exactly how these two things are lining up. We asked for this field film. We got back this field on the result film. We asked for the field episode ID and title. We got back the fields episode ID and title. And these were just created by calling functions. And in many cases, those functions are just simply looking at a property and returning that. So they're very, very simple. And in fact, GraphQL.js, you don't have to define a function if all it's doing is just looking up a property and sending it back. You'll also notice that here we were able to declare some arguments to our field. And this makes sense, right? If your fields are backed by functions, sometimes functions need arguments in order to do what you want them to do. One of the nice things about GraphQL is that you're not just, we could have done this with a call to a REST endpoint, right? We just would load a URL to get this film, and we would get back these fields. It is kind of nice that we're only getting back exactly what we asked for and nothing more, right? If we ask for more fields, we get more fields. But where GraphQL really starts to shine is when you start to ask questions that pass from one resource to another. And so what I mean by that is, let's say that we wanted to know, there we go, starship connection. So we wanted to know all the different starships that appeared in an episode. Uh-oh. There we go. So if we wanted to know all the different starships that appeared in the episode, then a REST API might return this as a list of URIs. And then we would have to go load each URI. And in fact, that's exactly what Swappy is doing under the hood here. It's giving us URIs, and then we're loading those URIs, and then walking down further to ask for the name. And we could go deeper than this. So one of the cool things is, let's see, pilot connection. So each starship has a pilot. Also, by the way, do you notice that this just got underlined with red here? This is what I mean when I said validation. So GraphQL knows the types of things, and it knows that pilot connection is going to give us back a JSON object. And we don't want just an empty JSON object, so it's going to require that we add a selection of even more fields here. So I have to make sure that I add that. The reason that I am asking for pilot connection pilots, you don't necessarily have to set up your API that way. We chose to here because it offers the ability to ask a couple extra questions at this point in the query. So if all you wanted was the total count of the pilots, then you could do pilot connections total count. So now we're going to get the pilots for each of these things. Some of these don't list pilots, but some of them do. And so this is interesting again, right? So now it's not only that we're loading this film, and then we're loading every starship that was connected to that film, but we're also loading all the pilots of those starships. We're asking for their names. And of course, we could go deeper still. So we could ask for, say, the home world of the pilot. And so now we're getting this episode, we're getting starships that appear in the episode. Here's the Millennium Falcon. We're loading up a pilot who's Chewbacca, and then we're loading the home world, which is yet another URI hop in order to get the name of that home world. And by the way, from home world, we can ask for even more things, all kinds of really great stuff that you can find in the Swappy API, of course. But also you can ask for things like residents. So yeah, I want to know who are the residents that live on one of these homeworlds. And now you're looking at, here's the Millennium Falcon, which appears in episode 1, which is piloted by Chewie, which is on the homeworld Kashyyyk, which has the residents Chewie and Tartful and R2-D2. And so when I've done this, what I've done is really, I've hopped through multiple different resources that if I was just writing a SQL query would have required some pretty sophisticated joins, or if I was using a more traditional REST API, would have required me to do multiple round trips to my server. And here, not only am I getting this back in one request, but I'm getting that data back in a form that very closely mirrors the shape of the query that I've written. So if I look at my query, I would know that I could type out film.starshipconnection.starships, at 0, it's pilot connection at pilots at 0, at homeworld, at resident connections, ... and just dot into this data and get exactly what I want. I don't have to think about what format is this going to come back in the server, or go look up some documentation in order to make sure that I understand it correctly. If I'm looking at my query, I know exactly what I'm going to get back from the server. This is, of course, still making round trips, multiple round trips to the REST endpoint, but it's doing that on the server. And this is really important when your client is very sensitive to network activity, which is exactly the case when you're talking about iOS and Android applications that might be running in some adverse network conditions, 4G, 3G, 2G connections. So that's querying with GraphQL. I want to show you a little bit about the reference implementation itself, GraphQL.js. We're going to dive into that. And in subsequent episodes of these screencasts, I'm going to go into each topic in depth and explain exactly what's going on, so there's no mysteries as to how this stuff works. But in order to keep this episode relatively short, I'm just going to do a quick overview. So here we are looking at GraphQL.js, and in the source folder here, you can see there's really only a few things at the top. There's an index file that is really only responsible for exporting a bunch of stuff for you to use. There's GraphQL.js, which is very short, and it just ties a couple pieces together. And then there's one of these submodules for each main part of what GraphQL is responsible for. And in fact, each of these submodules maps more or less directly to a chapter in the specification. The main ones to pay attention to here are type, which is where we're going to define a type schema in various types. The language, which is tools for parsing and visiting an abstract syntax tree of after parsing the language. There's execution here, which gives us the tools for actually performing an execution of a GraphQL query given a type system that you've defined. And then there's validation, which ensures that our GraphQL queries are valid given that type system. A brief overview through each of these, just to kind of look at the APIs. Let's start in language. So the index file in each one of these submodules is only about exporting what you can use. In language, what you can do is, the main ones is that you're going to parse. So that's the biggest thing in here. Some of these other ones they're useful. We expose them because you can use them in tools, but very rarely are you actually going to use them in practice. Lex is our lexer, which is part of a parser, and I'll talk a little bit about in a future episode how those things work. Kind describes our ASTs. Get location allows you to provide an AST node and get back exactly where it appeared in the actual incoming text of the language. And we use that even in graphical. So if I go back to our graphical tool here and I misspell something and it's underlined red here, get location is exactly the function that's getting called in order to do that. And then these visit utilities allow us to walk through a parsed piece of language and ask questions along the way, learn things. It's a very useful small utility. So that's language. In type, we have a handful of predicates. So just if you have a type object and you want to know, is this an input type or an output type? Is it a leaf type, which includes scalars or enumerations? Is it a composite type, which is an object or an interface or a union, or an abstract type, which is an interface or a union? We have this concept of nullability. So if a value comes back null, the type describes whether that's okay or not. And so we can look at that. And then the definitions for these things. And you'll use these more than pretty much anything else in GraphQL JS, because usually when you're importing this thing, what you're doing is you're building the type system. And so what you're actually going to do is actually call new GraphQL object type, new GraphQL interface type, etc., and define what these things are and the functions that they need to call for each field. And then there's the handful of built-in scalars that we give you. We give you an int type, a float type, a string type, a Boolean type, and an ID type, which is really basically a string type, but it allows a little bit more flexibility in the language itself. So that's a type system. The execution just gives you execute. That's it. Execute just takes in a query that you've parsed, a type system that you've defined, and it runs it and it gives you back a result. That's all execute does. Validation just runs validate, kind of the similar idea. You give it a parsed piece of the GraphQL language, a type system that you define, and then it returns back to you a list of all the errors that it found, if any. It also returns to you the specified rules, and these are all the validation rules defined by the GraphQL spec. So if you go look at that again, let's open the spec, and we scroll down here to validation. Every one of these things under the validation chapter is a rule. We describe the rule with some examples, with a little bit of formal specification. And if reading code is more your style, then you can look at GraphQL JS, and there's a rules folder underneath validation where every one of those rules defined in the spec has an implementation. So we make sure that your arguments are typed correctly, that you have default values that are typed correctly, that you are asking for fields on the correct types, that you're using fragments only where you're allowed to use fragments, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All of these rules apply to ensure that the query that you've provided is unambiguous and actually able to execute. And when we actually run a GraphQL query, let's look back at this GraphQL JS file again. What we're actually going to do is use all of those pieces together. So when you call the GraphQL function, you provide the schema that you defined, you provide the request string, which is the unparsed version of the GraphQL language, and you provide some values for variables if you'd used variables, and a root value if that's important. And the first thing we'll do is we'll build a source for that GraphQL file, and we'll parse it, and parsing it will give us that AST. We'll validate that AST with the schema and with the parsed document. And as I described before, that'll give us back an array of all of the errors. And if there are some errors, then we want to make sure that we return the list of errors. Otherwise, we want to execute. So we execute with the schema, the parsed document, and then the other values that you pass in. And that's all it does, because the output of that is exactly what we want to return back to you. When that's exactly what you see here on the right side of the screen is what the output of that function. And if any error occurs, then we catch that and we send that back to you as an error. And that's the whole thing. That's the overview of GraphQL. So in some future videos, I'm going to take each of these submodules and deep dive and explain exactly what's happening. And so if you're interested in learning how to design a language, either a query language or a programming language, then tune in for the language version. If you want to know more about defining type systems and all the different things that you can do, then look forward for the type episode. If you want to know exactly how the GraphQL execution engine is doing what it's doing, stay tuned for that one. And of course, we'll talk about validation as well and how we make sure that things are actually valid. And in a bonus one after that, we'll talk about the actual graphical tool and how that works. So hopefully this has been interesting. Again, if you found this valuable, it takes some of my time to do this, so please let me know if this has been useful. If you have any questions or comments, drop them in the comment box below on here or send me a tweet at Lee Byron. And thank you again for your time and attention. Until next time.